Today I have something for all the science fiction, fantasy, and horror writers out there. Hey, what up writers? I'm Violet and today I'm going to be sharing my thoughts on the book Writing Monsters by Philip Athans. Whew, I love craft books and I was down quite a craft book buying rabbit hole when I stumbled across this book here. And it was like an auto buy for me with that title, Writing Monsters. How to craft believably terrifying creatures to enhance your horror, fantasy, and science fiction. I was sold by that title alone, and I think it delivered on those things. Some of the craft books I've read haven't, but I didn't know exactly what to expect. I was like, yes, I'm getting a deep dive into monsters. When it arrived, I thought it's great quality, it's beautiful. I was so excited. And I have to say, it not only met my expectations, but it really broadened my mind in so many different ways. And I'm going to kind of get into what I thought about this. So it's broken down into 3 sections. Part 1, what they are. Part 2, why they're here. And part 3, how to write them. And the beginning of the book starts off with this monster creation form, and it's just sort of a list of 12 different questions, like a little sort of character sheet for creating a monster. And then throughout the text, he'll sort of include the different sections and how to fill them out with examples and what you should consider when filling out those sections. He also at the very beginning sort of includes the different types of monsters that are going to be included as examples, like great monsters, archetypes, real world monsters. Hold on, let me check what else was on the list. Monstrous things. So it wasn't just like one type of monsters, and it really broadened my mind about what monsters are, because he included things like real world monsters like sharks or natural disasters, which I wouldn't naturally think as monsters, or about monstrous things like cursed items, haunted houses, ghost ships, which are also in a way monsters or can act as a monster in a story. So it really broadened my mind in that way of thinking. And I think actually this is great as an idea generator. That's really what I think shines in this book. If you're a writer and sort of looking for ideas, reading over this book, it'll be like, wow, I never thought about doing that, or even taking this twist on that, or spinning this trope. It really, like, I had a notebook out the whole time, not only writing sort of ideas and thoughts about this book, but also sort of how to enhance the stories I'm currently working on and ideas of things I would like to include or try out in future stories. It was great for that because, you know, one of my stories is nicknamed the High School Monster Hunter Project. So I mainly picked it up to fine-tune the monsters in that story, but I also have this vampire plot bunny, which I really pulled out of the woodworks just from reading this, because the stuff about vampires in here really inspired me. Speaking of vampires, without even looking at the copyright of this book, I could sort of guess when it was written because of the references. It talks about vampires being the total boom that has been overflooded the market, and zombies being the newest thing. And it also talks about like the scary Ebola virus and how pandemics could be so scary, and it was a sign of the times there. So yeah, this book was published in 2014, and there's definitely moments where you feel the 2014 coming through. Another thing about the examples that were used is this is a very Lovecraft forward story. Right on the cover it says that the foreword is by the H.P. Lovecraft Historical Society, and in the back when he lists all of the examples that he used, there is one section just for the Lovecraft stories of all of the Lovecraft stuff that was used, which I think in a way is great. You need to sort of understand the foundation of horror and have those classics, have the Lovecraftian monsters, have the Draculas, have the Frankensteins, but as well as new spins and things, especially with the zombies. He talked about where zombies came from and how the spin and evolution of modern day zombies came, and I thought that was really cool. And yeah, there were several different things like that, but when it came to the examples, so here's the thing. Throughout, while he was explaining things, the examples that he used were really great. But when it came to the time where he would include text segments from different stories to be like, hey, here's this element used, really great. Read these couple paragraphs from, you know, this story. All of those text segments that were included were sort of those older stories or short stories that I wasn't familiar with, and I had a very hard time connecting with those prose, and it didn't really make the examples pop or resonate with me. Maybe other people like that writing style and it would pop with them. It just didn't hit me. But throughout the text, when he was just randomly pulling out examples, he had great examples in a variety of, like I said, short stories, TV, movies, video games. He does also talk about RPGs, Dungeons and Dragons, and how their formulations of monsters can be sort of useful and things for us to consider as writers. And I know there's a lot of crossover between the writing community and the D&D community, and he definitely brings that up and talks about how writers can use sort of those dynamics to be helpful when creating monsters in your world. So like I said, he has the different monsters, sort of categories of the archetypes and great monsters, and then there are these sections where he'll sort of do profiles on one of those fitting those descriptions. Like here's Archetypes dragons, and then kind of does a little, dragons gets their own little page, or here's monstrous things, ghosts, ships, kind of goes into it. And in a way it's like, oh my gosh, this feels like it's just scratching the surface. Like it made me realize how many things are considered monsters and how deep this really goes, because I thought this is going to be a deep dive, and in some places it really seems like really you're just getting a toe into some of this stuff. But he does several times say like, hey, you need to deep dive and do research, and he does talk about doing different research and looking into the origins of certain monsters and using that when you're sort of thinking about taking your spin on something. He said like one of the worst things you can do is think of a monster and a property that you love and just copy it without looking into the origins and the reasons why those creators chose that set of unique traits for that monster. One thing that I love to see in craft books that this didn't have any of was exercises, and I think a few exercises could have went a long way with this. Just, it really would have helped in my opinion. I also would have loved to see just more lists. It was cool that he did those character profiles, but it would have been great to be like, here's a list of a bunch of other monsters that would fit under that. Just because this was so great for like idea generating, it would have been cool if he would have just done some general lists of more monsters or traits or description. So those two things I would have been happy to see if there had been a few sort of writing exercises or more just bullet pointed lists of sort of idea generating things that could have been included in here. So a few things that it really gets into is the difference between like what is a monster versus a villain, and a monster versus just an animal or just a pet. And if you're and if your monster is coming off more as an animal or a pet, or a monster can be both a monster and a villain, and those sort of defining terms, which I thought is super helpful as a writer. Like, hey, my readers are saying that this isn't scary or isn't coming off as scary, and he's giving you here reasons why. And also about monsters having different meaning and the themes and symbolisms about monsters, and not to be too on the nose with it, but you should also keep those things in mind. And even when you think about folklore and some like myths of monsters, and some about the real life societal things that people were trying to say with their monsters at the time, and when you peel back the layers, what it's really saying about humanity. And that's really great to keep in mind. Some of my favorite sections were talking about the sizes of monsters, which it gave me a lot of things to consider in my own writing. I also liked monsters as agents, sort of like henchmen monsters. I really enjoyed that section. I also enjoyed cliches versus archetypes. That was another one. That was one of my personal favorite sections of this book. And of course, there's talk about the powers, weaknesses, abilities. Oh, another great section that I really liked was the staging, the reveal, about, yeah, you can craft the perfect monster, but while you're writing it, if you don't set up the reveal of the monster, you could be missing out on a bunch of tension and a bunch of great suspense and horror, you know? And he does talk about also like horror versus gore and terror and these different terms. And I was really kind of introduced to some of that stuff for the first time. So I have to say, for somebody like me who was not really familiar with a lot of this stuff, was really helpful. But I think if you're like a sci-fi, fantasy, horror junkie, you write a lot of that, you read a lot of that, you're doing the RPGs and the video games and all those things, this might not give you that much new information. But for somebody like me who just kind of does a little bit paranormal and just sort of has a little bit of monsters included in my fantasy and some covered ideas that are a little bit more horror, I got a lot out of this. And for the idea generating alone, like I was keeping notes and notes of things I want to include in stories or how to tighten up stories I currently have. I really enjoyed this. It was different than any craft book I'd ever read, but I really like that in writing craft books. I would like to read more craft books that are very specific on one area or one thing, because I think that's a problem with some of the other craft books I've read, that even if they have one point that they're focusing on, there seems a need to throw in a bunch of sort of 101 general writing stuff. And it was refreshing to have something that was so focused where you weren't getting bogged down having to read through some of the 101 stuff. So I think that was definitely really cool. I found it very accessible. The writing style of Philip Athans was great. Really clear and forward, a few moments of humor that made me laugh. Again, the examples, some of them were a slog to get through, but that's, again, my personal preference. There wasn't anything super problematic in here. There was at the end section where he was talking about like capitalization and pronouns, and he didn't mention they as a pronoun, which I think is kind of a sign of the times, where these days it would be sort of a go-to standard pronoun. But again, this was in 2014, so it wasn't like it was done in a malicious way or anything. I think that was just a sign of the times thing. And in the end, in the back, there is a Lovecraft story, The Unnameable, that is annotated, that you can read through, and sort of he will point out the different places of Lovecraft's mastery in monsters, which is, I think that's a really cool thing to include. Even if I wasn't the biggest fan of the Lovecraft examples, I think you still have to, you know, pay credit where credit is due. So overall, I would recommend it, with the caveat of if you're not already super comfortable in monsters or that familiar, and even just as an idea generator, really great. So I got a lot out of this one, and I would like to read more sort of specific 201 writing craft books that I can find. I liked that it was genre specific to sci-fi, fantasy, and horror. I wish it would have went even a little bit more into the distinctions. In some places it was like, in sci-fi you can do this, in fantasy you can do this. I wish it would have went a little bit more into some of those, or even brought up category distinctions. It didn't bring that up, but in general, really, really cool stuff in this one. So I think that's all I have for this review. Thank you so much for watching, and I will catch you in the next one. Bye!